Hi guys, making another video here again to go over some of the beginning stages of the Cold War. So since not everyone was able to take a textbook home with them because we don't have enough for everyone, I made this handout here that kind of hits the highlights of section 1 of chapter 20 in your textbook that will help you complete some of these assignments that you have to do for the week. So it's all about the development of the Cold War. So I wanted to make this video just to kind of explain it a little bit further to you guys and help you maybe understand it a little better. So we'll start here at the top. It says, once the Axis powers were defeated, the differences between the US and the Soviet Union became clear. Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, he still feared the capitalist West, and United States leaders continued to fear communism. The Soviet government was not prepared to give up its control of Eastern Europe after Germany's defeat in World War II. Americans were not willing to give up the power and prestige the U.S. had gained throughout the world. Suspicious of each other's motives, the United States and Soviet Union became rivals. Between 1945 and 1949, a number of events led the two superpowers to oppose each other. So the next part of the handout here is just a list of some of these events that happened in the first several years of the Cold War that kind of lead us into the Cold War and set the stage for the rest of the Cold War that would carry on for almost 40 years. So, the basis of this whole thing here is that the United States and the Soviet Union had been allies during World War II. The only reason, really, that they were allies was because of Hitler. They both were fighting against Hitler, so they figured they would help each other out. It was not because they liked each other, agreed with the type of government, agreed with the type of leadership. They did not really get along other than having to for the war. Now that the war is over, Hitler's defeated, moving on, they realize, the Soviet Union and the United States realize that they just don't really like each other. Okay, the United States is a democracy, we have capitalism, and that goes directly against what they had in the Soviet Union, which is a communist dictatorship. So the leaders in the Soviet Union, Stalin, and the leaders in the United States, they started to kind of butt heads. And this is what starts this Cold War because we just really couldn't agree on the best way to handle things after World War II. Obviously, the Soviet Union felt that communism was the best way to go and they wanted to spread communism everywhere. The United States felt that democracy and capitalism was the best way to go, so they wanted to spread democracy and capitalism all around the world. And it just leads to this conflict that goes on for 40 some years between the two most powerful countries in the world, the United States and the Soviet Union. So one of the first things that happens in Eastern Europe. Okay, so this is the first place that they did not agree. Okay, so the United States and Great Britain believed that the nations of Eastern Europe should freely determine their own governments. Okay, they wanted democracy in those areas where Hitler had control during World War II. Now Hitler doesn't have control. The US and Great Britain say those countries should now decide for themselves what type of government they have. Stalin, who was afraid that those nations would turn against the Soviet Union, did not like that idea. So the Soviet Union decided to stay in those conquered areas. So all of the areas that the Soviet Union had occupied toward the end of World War II as they were kicking Hitler out, instead of leaving those countries to decide for themselves, Stalin took control and made them communist states, a part of the Soviet Union. In this area, okay, we have Greece, country of Greece. And this was a civil war, a place where civil war was going on, which created another conflict. Okay, the communists and the anti-communists who were supported by Britain, they were fighting for control of Greece. Okay, Britain was forced to withdraw its aid to Greece because they had their own problems at home. So now we have this conflict. Are the communists going to take over in Greece and make Greece a communist country, or are the non-communists going to win and make Greece a non-communist country? So that leads us into the second event, which is the Truman Doctrine. So the United States was led by President Truman. So he took over towards the end of World War II when President Roosevelt died while in office. So President Truman was the vice president, now he's the president. So he was very nervous about the British withdrawing from Greece, so he decided to create what he called the Truman Doctrine, where he said that the United States would provide money to any countries, Greece in this particular case, that were threatened by communist expansion, because he felt that if the Soviets or the communists were not stopped in Greece, then the US would have to face the spread of communism throughout the world. So this creates what we call our containment policy, where we're trying to keep communism where it's at. We don't want it to spread. So we think if it spreads to Greece, then that's going to be bad, because then it'll just start spreading throughout the whole world. So we're going to give help to anybody who needs it that is trying to resist communism. Now, to expand this, we get what's called the Marshall Plan. Okay, so the Marshall Plan comes along later on after the Truman Doctrine, and it's technically called the European Recovery Program, but the guy who came up with its name was Marshall, so they call it the Marshall Plan. And it was designed to rebuild the prosperity and stability of war-torn Europe. So the United States gave $13 billion in aid for Europe's economic recovery. So basically, we're just giving $13 billion to countries in Europe to try to help them rebuild after World War II. Because it takes a lot of money to rebuild after a war, and we didn't want another depression to happen like happened after World War I. Now, the kind of underlying beliefs here, the real reason that we decided to go ahead with this Marshall Plan was that we believed, or the United States at the time believed, that communist aggression was successful in countries where there were economic problems. So basically, we thought if a country was struggling with money and they were in a depression, financially wrecked, then they were more likely to look to communism to come in and save the day. If a country was doing fine financially, had enough money, was doing okay with their economy, then they would resist communism and not fall to communism. So in the Marshall Plan, the United States is going to try to contain communism, not by using our military, but by using money. So we're going to give these people money in hopes that they're happy enough that they won't look to the communists to come in and kind of save the day. That's the idea, at least. Now, the Soviets obviously didn't like this plan because they thought it was an attempt to buy the support of countries, so they put their own action or their own recovery plan into place, but it failed because they weren't as financially stable as the United States. The next thing here is containment. So I've been talking about it a little bit already, but by 1947, we had this split in Europe between the US and the Soviet Union. And this was pretty much a fact of life. Like, everybody knew it was there. It was pretty obvious. So George Kennan, who was a diplomat at the time, he argued first for this policy of containment to try to keep communism within its existing boundaries and prevent further Soviet and communist expansion. So containment becomes the U.S. policy for years to come. So all throughout the Cold War, we were trying to contain it. So remember, it's like we're putting it in like a Tupperware container, putting the lid on it, not letting it spread anywhere else. Just how you would put soup in a container to keep it from spreading, because if you dump soup out on a counter, it's going to spread out all over that counter and make a mess. We didn't want to make a mess with communism. We want to put it in that container, keep it there where it's already at, because we know we can't get rid of it where it's already at in the Soviet Union. But if we put it in this container and put our lid on it, we can keep it where it's at and it won't be as big of a threat. That was the idea. Now, the next problem comes with the division of Germany, because at the end of the war, the Allies had divided Germany into 4 different zones, each one of them occupied by the Allies. So the US took a zone, the Soviet Union took a zone, Great Britain and France each took a zone. Berlin, which is the capital of Germany, was also divided into 4 zones in the same way. So in 1948, Great Britain, France, and the US had already planned to unify their 3 western sections of Germany and their sections in Berlin, and they created a West German government. So basically a separate country called the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, was formally created. Okay, less than a month after that, a separate East German state, the German Democratic Republic, was set up by the Soviets. So now we have Germany split. On one side in East Germany, we have a communist nation. On the other side in West Germany, we have a democratic nation. So now the West Germany democratic nation is controlled by controlled by the United States, France, and Great Britain. The Soviets control East Germany, that is the communist. Now Berlin is within East Germany. So within West Berlin, the part that the United States controlled, even though it was a democracy, outside of Berlin, outside of that city, they're surrounded by communism. So that's going to cause some problems, like the Berlin airlift. So the Soviets didn't like the separate West German state. They didn't like that idea. So they were going to try to prevent it from happening by creating a blockade of West Berlin. So basically, they're going to not allow any trucks, trains, boats, anything like that to enter the city's western zone. So no food or supplies, anything's getting into the 2.5 million people that lived in those zones. So we came up, or the US came up with a solution called the Berlin Airlift, where they would just fly in using American British airplanes supplies. And they would just drop down supplies to those people to live on. So it went on for more than 10 months. We made more than 200,000 flights, 2.3 million tons of supplies, and eventually the Soviets didn't want to go to another war, so they finally gave in and lifted the blockade in May of 1949. So the people of West Berlin were saved. Now, around the same time, we get two different alliances. We have NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was formed in 1949. So this is the United States and Canada's alliance with all of the other democratic nations in the world, or with a lot of the other democratic nations in the world. We have them versus the Warsaw Pact, which is the Soviet Union's alliance with the communist countries in the world. We also have the arms race going on. So basically, the US and the Soviet Union have these intercontinental ballistic missiles. Easy way to think of it is like nuclear weapons. Okay, so we each have these nukes, and this arms race is just a competition between these two governments to create the most weapons, because they believe that if we have these huge amounts of nuclear weapons, that's actually going to prevent war, because neither side's going to launch a nuclear attack, they thought, because the other side would be able to strike back, and they didn't want that. So we have this arms race throughout the Cold War where both Soviet Union and the United States are trying to build up their military, build up their weapons as much as they can to try to have the best, most powerful weapons in the world. And then finally here we have the Berlin Wall. So Nikita Khrushchev was the leader of the Soviet Union starting in 1955. At the time, West Berlin, which was in the Soviet territory but controlled by the US, remained what they called a Western island of prosperity, because the rest of East Germany, controlled by the communists, was poverty-stricken, meaning poor. So a lot of these East Germans who were tired of living in the communist part managed to escape East Germany by going through West Berlin. So they would go into West Berlin, which is the democratic area, and be able to travel from there to other areas or stay in West Berlin and enjoy democracy. Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, thought that he needed to stop this flow of refugees because that's a bad look if they're trying to escape his communist regime. So in 1961, they started to build a wall separating West Berlin from East Berlin. Eventually, this wall becomes this massive barrier. It's guarded by barbed wire, floodlights, machine gun towers, minefields, dog patrols. Okay, it was very dangerous, actually, to try to go around the wall. You couldn't cross through the wall unless you had a certain passport. They would shoot you if you tried to sneak over the wall. So it was a pretty hostile situation for many, many, many years. And the Berlin Wall becomes this symbol of the division between the two superpowers, where on one side of the wall you have democracy, on the other side you have communism, and a whole lot of hostility between the two, which is kind of the definition of the Cold War as a whole. Alright, so I kind of sped through those there, but I wanted to explain them a little bit further. Use this handout, use this video to help you with your other assignments, to help you with the interactive notebook that you should be working on over the next few weeks, and hopefully this helps you understand this Cold War conflict and why it was going on. So as always, let me know if you guys have any questions. I'll be very, very happy to help you. See you later.